All right, so good evening, afternoon, morning to whenever time you watch this recording. I appreciate it. Those of you who are joining live, I appreciate you taking the time as well. Welcome to our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. This is a workshop that I started a couple semesters ago now, and it's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. Now, the schedule for the fall, we start way back in August with the country of Afghanistan and then Haiti. And then throughout the time, we've looked at countries, we looked at regions of the world. And just last week, we talked about China. So today, we're talking about Brazil. We'll take a break next week. So just know that there is no workshop on Thursday, November 25th. That's Thanksgiving. So hopefully, you're spending it with friends and family and having a nice meal. And then we'll come back and finish the last 3 weeks of the semester with our workshop. And if you are interested, you can check out the summer schedule, which was like an initial run of this workshop and kind of bringing together the ideas and the concepts that kind of have shaped it up to this point. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump to week 14. And for week 14, we'll be looking at the country of Brazil, which is located on the South American continent. It's the largest country on the continent and has a really interesting history and current issues that are going on. So we're going to learn about those tonight. So our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is to identify where the country of Brazil is located, just in case, right? We have to situate our geography. Next, we'll describe the conflict with respect to the indigenous community within Brazil. And then next, we'll describe opportunities for cooperation on things like the environment and migration. So first, we'll start with a little bit of background on the country of Brazil, and I'll go ahead and open up the CIA World Factbook. As you know, this is like the go-to site that I use to kind of introduce countries. It's a very authoritative source. It's public domain, which means it's accessible. There's no paywall, and it kind of just lets you learn more about every country in the world, at least from the perspective of our Central Intelligence Agency. So I'll go ahead and have this introduction of Brazil read to us, and then we'll go into the parts of conflict and cooperation. So let me go ahead and have this read out loud.
Following more than 3 centuries under Portuguese rule, Brazil gained its independence in 1822, maintaining a monarchical system of government until the abolition of slavery in 1888 and the subsequent proclamation of a republic by the military in 1889. Brazilian coffee exporters politically dominated the country until populist leader Getulio Vargas rose to power in 1930. By far the largest and most populous country in South America, Brazil underwent more than a half-century of populist and military government until 1985, when the military regime peacefully ceded power to civilian rulers. Brazil continues to pursue industrial and agricultural growth and development of its interior. Having successfully weathered a period of global financial difficulty in the late 20th century, Brazil was seen as one of the world's strongest emerging markets and a contributor to global growth. The awarding of the 2014 FIFA World Cup and 2016 Summer Olympic Games, the first ever to be held in South America, was seen as symbolic of the country's rise. However, from about 2013 to 2016, Brazil was plagued by a sagging economy, high unemployment, and high inflation, only emerging from recession in 2017. Former President Dilma Rousseff, 2011 to 2016, was removed from office in 2016 by Congress for having committed impeachable acts against Brazil's budgetary laws, and her vice president, Michel Temer, served the remainder of her second term. In October 2018, Jair Bolsonaro won the presidency with 55% of the vote and assumed office on the 1st of January 2019.
And so if you go ahead and I'll post this link in the chat, and it's obviously on the PowerPoint. If you want to learn more about the geography, people and society, environment, and so on of the country of Brazil, you can obviously scroll down and read about these different things, different aspects. And it just overall gives you a really healthy introduction to any country. So that's why I like using this source for information. So it's there for you to check out. Now, with that background, I think 2 important things to highlight. First is that there's a history of military rule in the country. And it wasn't until 40 years ago where that military rule peacefully ceded power to civilian rule. And so I would say the country of Brazil is a relatively new government, and how it exercises power is relatively new as well. So this is like a meaningful example where countries that have experienced military rule can transition to civilian control. The second one is just the sheer size of Brazil, which is enormous as a country. And as you know, it's the home of most of the Amazonian rainforest, the major Amazon River, and borders almost every other country in South America, with the exceptions of Chile and Argentina. But it has a real close relationship with all the countries in the region, given its size and scope. And as you learn more about the country, you realize it's a very interesting dynamics with the coastal cities, with the interior cities, with the cities that are located towards their neighboring countries like Venezuela or Colombia or Peru or Bolivia. And overall, just a very dynamic part and engine for the continent of South America, and a growing player at the world stage as well. Now, what I'd like to do next is focus on some conflict. And in looking at different aspects of conflict, I wanted to focus on the indigenous community and how the indigenous peoples of Brazil have clashed with the government over time. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this first article about indigenous protesters clashing with the government. And this was back in June of this year. So I'm going to go ahead and have this article read to us, since it's pretty short. And I might change the voice as well, since I always like mixing it up. And let me change the voice options. And just says, for some people, point out to me like, wow, I didn't know like Microsoft Edge can like speak to me in different languages, or at least speak to me in different tones. I'm like, yes, it can. And I highly encourage it, just because it helps bring things to make it more dynamic, I would say. So I'll go ahead and have this dialect spoken.
Indigenous protesters armed with bows and arrows clashed Tuesday with police outside Brazil's Congress, leaving the area enveloped in tear gas and leading lawmakers to suspend debate on a controversial land reform bill. Activists said 2 indigenous people were hospitalized with severe injuries, and a dozen more sustained light injuries in the clashes, while the Congressional Press Office said at least 3 police officers were wounded with arrows. The press office said around 500 protesters tried to invade one of the entrances to Congress, and that police responded with tear gas, stun grenades and pepper spray after coming under attack with arrows. However, organizers said the protest was peaceful and that police brutally repressed it. Videos posted on social media by the protesters showed indigenous people in traditional feather headdresses and body paint screaming, running and dragging what appeared to be an injured man through a haze of tear gas. Today is a troubling day for the right to protest, and for democracy, lawmaker Jonia Wapichana, Brazil's first indigenous congresswoman, told a news conference. The events led lawmakers in the lower house to suspend a committee session on FA21, a bill that would change the regulations establishing protected indigenous lands. Indigenous rights groups warned the bill would pave the way for things such as mining, hydroelectric dams and road construction on previously protected reserves. Far-right President Jair Bolsonaro has been pushing to open protected lands to such development since taking office in 2019. Critics say that would accelerate the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, a vital resource in the race to curb climate change.
So this first article just introduces us to, or at least the rudiments of this conflict internally within Brazil, between the indigenous community and the government. And I think 2 important things to point out is that their indigenous community has a real strong and rich history in the continent of South America and in the country of Brazil. And for much of the time, there's been respect for that. One, because it's been difficult to access the interior parts of the country prior to major transportation and other investments. And at the same time, there's just the culture of Brazil was to understand and to know that. The second thing is obviously with change in political administrations, in this case, Bolsonaro being the latest president elected, that people view his actions as being anti-indigenous, because they're looking to basically develop the interior where many of the indigenous communities reside, even though there was an understanding and a respect for those communities in the past. So this is one of the challenges, right? Tensions internally within countries between the indigenous or native populations and from interests, whether governmental, non-governmental, or private, that are trying to motivate these changes in lands that aren't theirs. The second conflict is just building on this this conflict between the government and the indigenous communities. But this is an update from just yesterday. So I'm gonna go ahead and have this read to us as well, because I think it gives us even further insight to see how this tension is evolving within the country.
Sao Paulo, November 17, Reuters, Brazilian military police clashed with an indigenous group in the northern Amazon state of Roraima during an operation to remove a roadblock, the state government said on Wednesday, as tensions mounted on the reserve over illegal gold mining and land invasions. The Raposa Serra do Sol Reserve, site of the incident which occurred on Tuesday, has become a flashpoint for rival indigenous movements. https://www. The Indigenous Council of Roraima, CIR, said 6 people were injured in a confrontation it called an invasion. On Facebook, it shared photos of the aftermath, including an image of indigenous men with bleeding wounds to the head and chest. CIR has said the barricades are designed to stop illegal gold miners from entering the territory. In a statement released by the Roraima state government, police said they were following a judicial order to remove roadblocks from highways. They said the organizers of the roadblock had initially dispersed when the police arrived, but later returned with a group of some 100 people, armed with bows, arrows and machetes. One policewoman was hit by an arrow in the leg, the statement said, adding she was recovering well. At no point were lethal weapons or ammunition used, the police said. Tensions have been mounting between the two main indigenous groups on Raposa Serra do Sol, which Reuters reported. https://www. CIR have vowed to protect the land against illegal gold miners who are increasingly digging on the reserve. A rival group, the Society for the Defense of the United Indians of Roraima, SODIA, supports gold mining and argues they have the right to exploit resources beneath the land. SODIA went to the courts requesting roadblocks be removed. In a statement, SODIA said it supported the police operation and that the barricade had been inspiring violence between indigenous people. Bolsonaro has thrown his support behind SODIA, meeting several times with its leadership, visiting one of their communities on the reserve last month and endorsing their vision for mining on indigenous land. The president has encouraged mining and commercial agriculture on indigenous reservations and has sent a bill to Congress in an attempt to legalize the activities. If you want to plant, plant. If you want to mine, then mine, he said during the visit to Raposa Serra do Sol. Indigenous rights activists say Bolsonaro is exacerbating tensions within tribes through divide and conquer methods that historically helped destroy native lands worldwide. Reporting by Stephen Eisen.
And so this is a pretty interesting article because it kind of starts to unpack, right, that it isn't just between the government and the indigenous community but that there's differences of preferences and of opinions and of interest within the indigenous community. But it also describes here how when the government picks a side within the indigenous community, that it exacerbates tensions within it. And so what's fascinating here, I think, is that when you think of conflict, right, and we're exploring conflict with in Brazil, we realize that it isn't just about like conflict between countries, right? But it's a conflict within a country, and it can be conflict between different communities. And for much of the past workshops that we've described, it's always looking at conflict, maybe between the civilians and the government. But this is like one of the first times I'm having us focus on the indigenous communities, because there's a few different aspects with any indigenous community in any country. First is that they're the first peoples, right? That they're the true natives, or the ones who'd been there since before most of these lands were even countries as we understand them today. Secondly is that in many parts of the world, largely here in the United States, in South and Central America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, that this history where governments are involved from overseas and then start to shape the country's politics, basically have excluded, if not committed, acts of terror and others against the indigenous populations. And it's unfortunate that's happened, but as we recognize this history, we know that those simmering tensions still exist, and that they have to be brought to bear, and they have to be reconciled, and they have to be understood as shaping the politics of any particular country. So here we're just starting to get a little bit of a sense of how that's shaping the politics within Brazil. Now, not being from Brazil or knowing the political, cultural history, in any greater depth, we could go and investigate further, like, okay, so how are like the people of Brazil interpreting these actions? Like, is there general popular support for the indigenous community as a whole? Like, what are some of the laws being proposed in their legislature to address these concerns? What are the debates? What are the arguments being made? So if you're interested in these kinds of things, you can obviously look to Brazil, and you can look to any country where there's history exists, and see what those conversations are. Just to understand that the indigenous population just has this, it should have a revered place in any country's history, largely because their communities were there long before these political borders and governments were established. Now, this is conflict, right? Internal. And so what we'll look to next are cooperation and two examples. And these are just more opportunities for cooperation, because you'll start to see that maybe there's some conflict here, but obviously, hopefully, different governments or groups can work together. So the first one is we'll look at refugees in Roraima and Brazil's response to Venezuela's migration by the Wilson Center. So let me go ahead and open up this link. And this should be a short video. We'll go ahead and have this played for us. And so this short video provides us, actually, I think, with a really short but informative introduction to a challenge that we see all around the world, which is populations moving from one country to another, and that creating tensions. But in this case, it seems as if the Brazilian government has taken a proactive, cooperative approach, not only with its states and localities, but with the country that is where the migrants are coming from, to try to see how they can be best received and supported. Now, when we think of migration, we think of immigration, we kind of see it from, at least those of us who are in the United States, we see it from this American context and how it becomes a divisive issue with new people coming into the country. And, the language that's used and the rhetoric that's used has kind of really gotten heated, definitely in the past 20 years, since people see it as a political issue, right? But if you take away the politics for just a second and try to analogize what's happening in Brazil to what we see here, is that they're just people, right? People are moving from one place to the other for a variety of reasons: conflict, scarcity, threat, natural disasters. And every country approaches it differently. We're seeing this situation right now in Belarus and Poland, so maybe we'll talk about that next week. But when people move from one part, from one country to the other, you can either react in a negative or in a neutral or in a positive way. And it seems like as if Brazil is reacting in a positive way, which demonstrates some degree of cooperation that they want to exercise as obviously migrants coming into their country, but being a leader on the continent of South America. Now, the second aspect of cooperation is the Amazonian rainforest. And I'm going to go ahead and open up this article, which highlights how the Amazon has seen its worst deforestation levels in 15 years. And so I'm going to go ahead and have this play to us. Not most of them, maybe we'll see right now. I'll go ahead and have this read to us.
A report by Brazil's space research agency, INPE, found that deforestation increased by 22% in a year. Brazil was among a number of nations who promised to end and reverse deforestation by 2030 during the COP26 climate summit. The Amazon is home to about 3 million species of plants and animals, and 1 million indigenous people. It is a vital carbon store that slows down the pace of global warming. According to the latest data, some 13,235 square kilometers, 5,110 sq miles, was lost during the 2020 to 21 period, the highest amount since 2006. Environment Minister Joaquim Leite said the data represents a challenge and said we have to be more forceful in relation to these crimes. He added that the data does not exactly reflect the situation in the last few months. How your chicken burger? Illegal mining. Deforestation of the Amazon has increased under President Jair Bolsonaro, who has encouraged agriculture and mining activities in the rainforest. He has also clashed with INPE in the past over its deforestation, accusing the agency in 2019 of smearing Brazil's reputation. But at November's climate conference in Glasgow, Brazil was among a number of nations who signed a major deal to end and reverse the practice. The pledge included almost £14 billion, $19.2 billion of public and private funds. Some of that will go to developing countries to restore damaged land, tackle wildfires, and support indigenous communities.
And so what we read here is that obviously there's Brazil's own space agency is reporting that deforestation is increasing, right? Which would suggest that there's some degree of transparency with the data that's being provided. And then you start to hear a little bit of conflict, right? That the president of Brazil doesn't, has issues with the space agency releasing this information or sharing it. But the idea is that over the past couple of weeks, there was a conference in Glasgow in Scotland to bring together leaders from all over the world to debate, discuss, and deliberate, like, what can the world do to address climate change? And one of the tensions that was brought there is like, well, Brazil has this like very unique role because of its Amazon rainforest and just the role it plays in not just its own continental ecosystem, but in the global ecosystem. And, what can we do to support Brazil so that it doesn't continue to support policies or allow for destruction and deforestation of the Amazonian rainforest. And so in my mind, like, even though this is maybe a point of conflict, tension, right, that this is like a major area where you need cooperation. Like, you need Brazil, you need the country of Brazil, you need the government of Brazil, you need the people of Brazil to say, like, this is like your special responsibility, right? Like, each country has like these special things. Like, we have the Grand Canyon, like, for example, like, we don't just fill it up with trash because we feel like it, right? We say this is like one of those things that the world just needs to have, and we need to take care of it. Just like Brazil needs to say, like, this is one of the things that we have, and we need to take care of it for the world. So my hope is that there's greater cooperation. Now, last thing I want to point out is this, implications of all, this conflict and cooperation. I just wanted to share the Wilson Center, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and they have what's called the Brazil Institute. And I just want to read this out loud. So the Brazil Institute is the only country-specific policy institution focused on Brazil in Washington. So in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of think tanks and other groups, but this is the only one that's focused on Brazil. And it works to foster understanding of Brazil's complex reality and to support more consequential relations between Brazilian and U.S. institutions in all sectors. So this is like one of the implications, right? When you have a country which has its own unique challenges and dynamics, but also its unique role in the world, that you want to have folks thinking about it, you want to have folks paying attention, you want to have folks involved. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up and get to our discussion. I appreciate you guys listening and taking the time. And thanks again, and enjoy your holiday break. And we'll see you next time. So take care.